be something radically different, and that something different had to be worked out between the different religious factions, and the different religious factions were talking together. Now, I've had a similar experience of this sort in Brazil after Bolsonaro got elected, and that, of course, is a very right-wing and evangelical Christian government. There are in Brazil several left parties. I mean, of course, there is the Workers' Party, which is the big one, but then there are several fragmented parties along now. Each political party has its own think tank, which is supported by government. If you have representation in Parliament, you get some money to set up a think tank which is going to do policy research. And there are six political parties of the left. And they have, generally speaking, not been in good communication with each other. In fact, they've been pretty angry at each other. But this time, when I arrived there, all six parties had collectively got together and staged a week-long reflection, really, on the political situation, and therefore all came together. And at the end of the week, when I was sort of participating in this, there was one sort of mass rally in which all of the political leaders came together. All of them gave talks together. All of them hugged each other on the stage, and so suddenly the left is all together in a way which had not been there before. The same, actually, I gather, is the case in Chile. Different left factions have actually got together and started to talk with each other about the whole kind of prospect of creating a new constitution. So maybe something is different this time, which is that all of these mobilizations have the potentiality to start to have some staying power because they start to get institutionalized and organized. See, there's a big difference between mobilization and organization. And I think what we've seen is a great capacity to mobilize, with the Women's March or whatever, the immigrant rights marches and so on. So there's a lot of mobilization going on, but long-time organization seems to be lacking. And what we now see is perhaps the beginnings of the signs in all of these cases of the coming together of all of those people who feel that there is something wrong with the basic economic model, and the basic economic model has to be changed in such a way as to provide health and well-being and good education and good pension rights and all the rest of it to the mass of the population, rather than delivering strong economic growth and strong economic benefits for the top 1% or the top 10%. So this is then the issue. And I've been trying to think very much about, is there a central contradiction in the way in which capital is working these days, which really requires to be addressed? And if so, what would that central contradiction be? Well, an obvious, serious problem is level of social inequality. Almost every country in the world has experienced an increase of social inequality over the last 30 years, and it has gone so far that I think a lot of people feel it has gone too far, and that therefore there has to be some sort of movement to try to recapture a much greater level of equality in society, that better goods and services have to be delivered to the mass of the population. So that is one question. The second question is not social inequality, but it is the problem of climate change. We know that climate change has reached a point where there has to be some sort of collective response. And the urgency of this, from reports, but also from data, I think is becoming clearer to more and more people around the world. For example, I was checking the other day a graph of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration here in the United States has produced a graph of of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. How they get that, I'm not quite sure, but you can get back in the rocks and see what the carbon levels were from the rock geological record. So it's not been more than 300 parts per million over the last 800,000 years until around 1960, when it broke through the 300 parts per million. It's now at 400 parts per million, which says basically the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere have not been seen at this level over the last 800,000 years, and we've really got to go back to the times of the dinosaurs and all the rest of it to put ourselves in a climate situation of the sort that we've now got, now is predicated by this high level of carbon concentrations. These levels of carbon concentrations, by the way, will not easily dissipate, and even if there are zero emissions from now on, the levels of carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are enough to do serious damage to the world's, for instance, the Greenland ice pack, the Arctic ice, the Himalaya snowpack. All of that will disappear, even if there are no more carbon emissions, and it will disappear unless something major is done about carbon extraction from the atmosphere. So there are environmental questions. There's social inequality, there's environmental questions. And at the same time, there are also other reasons why one can start to say that the kind of form of capital that exists right now is unreasonable. It is actually barbaric, and that needs, therefore, to be replaced by another economic order, in exactly the same way that Marx was outraged by the kinds of factory conditions that he was witnessing, or at least he was being told about or learning about in Britain. So we can look at the factory conditions in Bangladesh or in China and everywhere and kind of say, look, this is no way in which a civilized world should organize its production. So there are these things, but I think there is an additional factor right now, one which Marx did not actually have to deal with, but which I think is very critical for us right now. We have a situation where capital is always about growth. It has to be about growth because it's always about the pursuit of profit, and a healthy capitalist economy is one where everybody has positive profits, which means that there's more value at the end of the day than there was at the beginning, and that more value at the end of the day is then used to create even more value. So the capitalist growth, and I've had occasion to point this out in former podcasts, capitalist growth is about compound growth. And compound growth is itself right now becoming the problem. The size of the global economy doubles about every 25 years. Now, in Marx's time, the doubling of the size of the economy in 25 years really didn't pose a problem. But it's beginning to pose that kind of problem where we need to go from $4 trillion economy that existed in 1950 to a $40 trillion economy as of the year 2000, to an $80 trillion economy. We're coming close to that right now, which is then going to be a $160 trillion economy by 2050, which is going to be a 320 by 2075 and a 640 at the end of the century. So the doubling of the rate is going to become a very, very serious problem. And this is what compound interest does. And Marx is very fond of quoting from something that was written by a man called Richard Price back in 1772, who wrote a tract about compounding interest. And what Price did was to say this, that if you invested 1 penny on the date of the birth of Jesus Christ, and it grew at a 5% compound rate, by the time you get to 1772, you would need 150 spheres the size of planet Earth, all solid gold, to give you enough money equivalent of what that penny had become under compounding at 5% a year since the birth of Jesus Christ. If, however, you only charge simple interest, that is, you didn't compound the interest, by the time you get to 1772, the total amount you would need, he counted, was 1 penny would have become something like £7, 20 shillings and something or other. Compounding growth is something which cannot be sustained. We are at that point where compounding growth has started to actually accumulate at such a rate that it's become a global kind of problem. And the capitalist economy right now is having real difficulties of satisfying the requirement of profitable investment opportunities for $40 trillion as of 2000, $80 trillion around now. And where is it going to be invested in, and how is it going to be invested? That is the real problem we're looking at. Now, this is a critical problem, and there are various things that are happening in the economy because, as Marx points out, there's only one kind of capital that can accumulate without limit, and that kind of capital is, in fact, money capital, provided that money is just simply about numbers. Now, when money was constrained by gold, it couldn't accumulate infinitely because there's only a finite amount of gold and that finite amount. But in 1971, we got off the gold standard. The money supply of the world was liberated from any restraints of any contact with gold. And so we get this tremendous kind of growth in the money supply since 1970 or so. Because the money supply is simply whatever the central banks of the world decide it's going to be, with the US central bank, the Federal Reserve, being critical in this because most transactions in the world occur on their dollar contracts, and so the dollar is the reserve currency, and when we get into difficulties, the Federal Reserve simply prints more money, and we see this compounding of the quantity of the money in circulation. But then the question is, what is that money going to do, and how is it going to actually earn a profit? And we've seen all sorts of adjustments in the global economy to deal with that problem. But there is what Marx called a realization problem of how on earth can you reinvest all of this money in such a way that it creates more profit. And where is that profit going to come from? So that is, if you like, one half of the problem. But the other part of the problem is this, that in Marx's time, if there was a sudden collapse of capitalism, most people in the world would be able to feed themselves and reproduce, because most people were self-sufficient in their local area with the kinds of, things they needed to live on. In other words, people could put breakfast on their table irrespective of what was going on in the global economy. Right now, that's no longer the case. Most people in the United States, but increasingly, of course, in Europe and in Japan, and now increasingly in China and India and Indonesia and everywhere, are dependent entirely upon the delivery of food to them so that they get the food from the circulation of capital. In Marx's time, like I say, that would have not been true, but now there's a situation where probably around 70 or maybe 80% of the world's people are dependent upon the circulation of capital in order to assure their food supply, in order to deliver them the kinds of fuels which are going to allow them mobility, going to actually deliver them all the necessities to be able to reproduce their daily life. So this is I think a situation which I can really summarize in the following kind of way, that capital right now is too big to fail. we cannot imagine a situation where we would shut down the flow of capital. Because if we shut down the flow of capital, 80% of the world's population would immediately starve, would be rendered immobile, would not be able to reproduce themselves in very effective ways. So we cannot afford any kind of sustained attack upon capital accumulation. So the kind of fantasy that you might have had, or socialists or communists and so on might have had back in 1850, which is that, well, okay, we can destroy this capitalist system and we can build something entirely different. That is an impossibility right now. We have to keep circulation of capital in motion. We have to keep things moving, because if we don't do that, we are actually stuck with a situation in which, like as I've said, almost all of us would starve. And this means that capital in general is too big to fail. It is too dominant. It is too necessary to us, that we cannot allow it to fail. We have to actually spend some time propping it up, trying to reorganize it, and maybe shift it around very slowly and over time to a different configuration. But a revolutionary overthrow of this capitalist economic system is not anything that's conceivable at the present time. It will not happen, and it cannot happen, and we have to make sure that it does not happen. But at the same time, the other side of the coin is capital is too big, too monstrous, too huge to survive, that it cannot survive in its current form. So on the one hand, we can't do without it. On the other hand, it is on a suicidal path. So this is, if you like, what I think the central dilemma is. So that there are numerable contradictions in a capitalist system right now. One of the big contradictions, as I've mentioned, is the incredible class and social inequality. The second is the environmental aggregates. But then comes the kind of question of this too big to fail, too monstrous to survive contradiction. And I think that is the major contradiction that we should be addressing. And therefore, a socialist program or an anti-capitalist program of the sort that I would want is one about trying to manage this capitalist system in such a way that we stop it being too monstrous to survive, at the same time as we organize the capitalist system so that it becomes less and less dependent upon profitability and becomes more and more organized so that it delivers the use values to the whole of the world's population, so that the world's population can reproduce in peace and tranquility, rather than the way it's going right now, which is not peace and tranquility at all, but eruptions. And these eruptions can, of course, also lead to conflicts between different parts of the world and geopolitical conflicts and the like.